Some historical events are just stunning. One event that stunned the world was Henry Kissinger's secret and surprise visit to Beijing in July 1971. Why stunning? Enemies and adversaries don't visit each other, especially two countries like the US and China, which had experienced 2 decades of hostilities. Yet, looking back at this event of some 50 years ago, it is actually not surprising that Kissinger visited China. This visit conformed to another iron law in geopolitics: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In 1971, the primary enemy of the US was the Soviet Union. In theory, the Soviet Union and China were allied against the US. However, the US intelligence services must have learned that the Soviet Union and China had almost come to war as a result of border clashes across the Ussuri River in March 1969. A major ideological split had also developed between Mao and the Soviet leaders. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger were shrewd students of geopolitics. They saw the opportunity to take advantage of the Sino-Soviet split. So Nixon followed up quickly on Kissinger's visit with a visit to Beijing in February 1972. Most Americans cheered and welcomed these brilliant diplomatic moves. Yet it was also striking that so few American voices noted that the US was reconciling with the communist regime involved in two initiatives: the Great Leap Forward 1958 to 1962 and the Cultural Revolution 1966 to 1976, that had resulted in enormous human suffering and a significant loss of human lives. To put it simply, the US paid no attention to violations of human rights in China when it served US national interests to do so. Here too, American behavior was not exceptional. If any country, including the US, is asked to choose between its values and its national interests, it always puts national interests ahead of its values. This pragmatic decision by the US in 1971 to work with Communist China had major consequences. Until 1971, the China seat in the UN was occupied by the Kuomintang government, which only controlled the island of Taiwan. On 25 October 1971, even though the US delegation to the UN, led by George H.W. Bush, who later became president, opposed the switch, the UN General Assembly voted to recognize the People's Republic of China as the official representative. This was a big deal, as it gave Beijing veto power in the UN Security Council. As I have documented in my book, The Great Convergence, such veto power gives a country tremendous global influence. When Nixon visited Beijing in February 1972, the US and China also issued the famous Shanghai Communique. It contained the following critical clause on Taiwan. Quote, "The United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is part one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves." Unquote. This clause was critical to China, as the US acknowledged that Taiwan was not a separate and independent country, it was part of China. Nixon was removed from office by the Watergate scandal on August 9, 1974. 2 years later, a human rights activist, Jimmy Carter, became president. Despite his human rights background, he continued the realist policies of Nixon and Kissinger on China. Indeed, paradoxically, the big breakthrough in US-China relations, the establishment of diplomatic relations and the de-recognition of the DKMT regime in Taiwan, happened under Jimmy Carter on 1st January 1979. Two key players facilitated this transition. The first was the National Security Advisor of Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was a realist and anti-Soviet hawk. The second was the leader of China, Deng Xiaoping. This move forward also happened because, against the explicit warnings of China, Vietnam, a Soviet ally, invaded and occupied Cambodia, which was then ruled by the genocidal regime of Pol Pot, on Christmas Day 1978. The Soviet Union and their allies had overplayed their hand. Deng Xiaoping wisely visited the US in a highly publicized visit from 29 January to 5 February. By showing public closeness with the US, Deng was sending a signal to the Soviet Union that it should think twice about attacking China when China invaded Vietnam 1 month later in February 1979. Secondly, and very unusually, Deng allowed Chinese TV to show all the scenes from his visit to the US. Until then, the Chinese population had been fed Maoist propaganda telling them that the American workers led dark, oppressed lives as a result of being exploited by rapacious capitalists. Instead, Deng showed them that American workers lived in wonderful two-car garage homes with all the modern amenities. Deng was clearly taking a big risk in revealing to his people how they had been lied to by the previous Mao government. However, it also fulfilled Deng's goal of motivating the Chinese to work hard to achieve American living standards. Episodes like this demonstrate that there is no doubt that America made many significant contributions, consciously or unconsciously, towards stimulating the rejuvenation of China. However, Carter's decision to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing also resulted in a political backlash in Washington, D.C. Many in the US Congress were angry that an old ally, the KMT government of Taiwan, had been abandoned. Hence, the US Congress decided to pass the Taiwan Relations Act, TRA, of 1979. In an obvious contradiction to the letter and spirit of the Shanghai Communique, the TRA specified that the United States would provide arms to Taiwan and protect the security or the social or economic system of the people on Taiwan. The TRA is significant because it illustrates a deep ambivalence in the US attitudes towards China. On the one hand, China was welcome as an ally in Washington, D.C. against the Soviet Union. On the other hand, the distrust of the communist regime remained, with strong residual sympathy for Taiwan. Taiwan's attractiveness to the US further increased when Chiang Ching-kuo bravely allowed democratic reform to take place in 1986. This persistent contradiction in US policy towards China, recognizing Beijing as the sole government of China, which theoretically includes Taiwan, and also sympathizing with the Taiwan regime, has continued to bedevil relations between the US and China for decades. In the 1980s, however, as the Soviet Union remained the primary threat, especially under the hawkish right-wing regime of President Ronald Reagan 1980 to 1988, the relations between US and China became closer and closer. China even allowed CIA spy stations to be stationed on its territory. Both countries also cooperated militarily against the Soviet-installed regimes in Afghanistan and Cambodia. Since I served as a Singapore ambassador to the UN from 1984 to 1989, I saw at first hand the close and friendly cooperation between the US and Chinese delegations to the UN. Yet, in the late 1980s, two major events happened to disrupt this close relationship. The first was the emergence of Gorbachev as the leader of the Soviet Union. His decision to allow the dismantling of the Berlin Wall on 9th November 1989 signaled the end of the Cold War. China then became a less useful ally. The second was the outbreak of the student demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in May and June 1989. The decision of Deng Xiaoping to use military force to suppress these demonstrations caused enormous outrage and anger in the Western world. These two events signal that the honeymoon period in US-China relations, which had lasted almost 2 decades, was coming to an end.